A woman dies in childbirth in Moscow, 1860. Within days, her husband sells her body to a professor who preserves it like a museum piece. For the next 153 years, her mummified remains are displayed in glass cases, stolen by thieves, exhibited by Nazis, and passed between carnivals like a prized artifact. Her name was Julia Pastrana, and she spent more time dead on display than she ever did alive and free. This is the story of how 19th century science and entertainment turned a human being into a permanent exhibition, and why it took over a century for her to finally rest in peace. Julia Pastrana was born around 1834 in the mountains of Sinaloa, Mexico. She entered the world with two rare medical conditions that would define her entire existence. Hypertrichosis terminalis caused thick, dark hair to grow across her face and body, while gingival hyperplasia enlarged her gums and gave her an unusual facial structure. These conditions, occurring together, were so rare that Julia would become one of the most documented cases in medical history. Despite her unusual appearance, Julia was far from the primitive creature that showmen would later claim her to be. She stood about 4.5 feet tall and spoke multiple languages fluently, including Spanish, English, French, and Cajita, an indigenous language from her region. Julia was an accomplished performer who could sing, dance, and play musical instruments with remarkable skill. Her intelligence and talents would have made her extraordinary in any era, but in the 19th century, they made her a curiosity that people would pay to see. The details of Julia's early life remain murky, clouded by the sensational stories that promoters would later create about her origins. What is known is that she worked in the household of the governor of Sinaloa before being recruited by an American showman named Theodore Lent around 1854. Lent recognized the commercial potential in Julia's appearance and convinced her to travel to the United States to perform in what were then called freak shows. Lent marketed Julia with titles designed to emphasize her supposed connection to the animal kingdom. She was billed as the Ape Woman, Bear Woman, or Baboon Lady, depending on the venue and audience. These names weren't just marketing gimmicks. They reflected the scientific racism of the era, which often portrayed people with unusual conditions or from different ethnic backgrounds as links between humans and animals. Julia made her American debut in 1854 at Gothic Hall in New York City. The show was an immediate sensation, drawing crowds who came to gawk at what promoters claimed was a living example of Darwin's missing link. The marketing materials described her as half-woman, half-beast, found in the wilds of Mexico and barely civilized enough for public display. The reality was far different from the promotional fiction. Julia was a sophisticated performer who understood exactly what was happening to her. She participated in interviews with journalists and scientists, always maintaining her dignity despite the degrading circumstances. When people came to stare at her unusual appearance, she would often surprise them by engaging in intelligent conversation or demonstrating her musical abilities. From New York, Lent took Julia on tour across the United States and Canada. The shows were wildly profitable, with audiences paying premium prices to see what they believed was a genuine scientific curiosity. Julia's performances included singing, dancing, and demonstrations of her linguistic abilities, but these talents were always secondary to the main attraction: her appearance. In 1857, Lent brought Julia to Europe, where she performed at London's Regent Hall. European audiences were just as fascinated as their American counterparts, and the scientific community took particular interest in her case. Doctors and researchers examined Julia extensively, measuring her skull, studying her hair patterns, and documenting every aspect of her physical condition. The European tour marked the height of Julia's fame, but it also began the process that would lead to her posthumous exploitation. Scientists weren't just studying Julia as a living person, they were already discussing what might be learned from her body after death. The era's approach to medical research often treated people with unusual conditions as specimens first and human beings second. Julia's personal life became intertwined with her professional exploitation when she married Theodore Lent in 1860. The marriage was likely as much a business arrangement as a romantic union, ensuring that Lent would maintain complete control over Julia's career and earnings. The relationship also guaranteed that any children they might have would potentially inherit Julia's conditions, creating new opportunities for exhibition. The couple traveled to Russia in 1860, where Julia became pregnant. The pregnancy was difficult, and both she and Lent understood that childbirth would be risky given her physical conditions. On March 25, 1860, Julia gave birth to a son who inherited both of her conditions. The baby lived only 36 hours, and Julia herself died 5 days later from complications related to the birth. What happened next reveals the true nature of Julia's relationship with Theodore Lent and the extent to which she had been commodified even in life. Rather than arranging for a proper burial, Lent immediately began negotiating to have both Julia and her infant son preserved for continued exhibition. Within days of their deaths, he had sold both bodies to Professor Sokolov, a local embalmer who specialized in creating lifelike preserved specimens. If you want to understand how scientific racism and medical exploitation have shaped history, make sure to subscribe because we expose the darkest chapters of how society has treated those who were different. Sokolov's embalming process was remarkably sophisticated for the 1860s. He used a combination of chemicals and techniques that preserved not just the bodies, but also their hair, skin texture, and facial expressions. The result was so lifelike that viewers often had difficulty believing they were looking at preserved remains rather than living people posed behind glass. Lent quickly reclaimed the preserved bodies and resumed touring, now advertising Julia and her son as the ultimate scientific specimens. The morbid exhibitions drew even larger crowds than Julia's living performances had attracted. People who might have felt uncomfortable staring at a living person with unusual conditions felt no such reservations about examining preserved remains presented as scientific curiosities. The posthumous tour lasted for years, with Lent traveling across Europe and returning to North America with his macabre cargo. The preserved bodies were displayed in glass cases, often accompanied by detailed explanations of Julia's medical conditions and fabricated stories about her origins. The exhibitions were presented as educational, giving audiences permission to stare and speculate without guilt. When Theodore Lent died in the 1880s, Julia's remains passed to other showmen and eventually became part of various traveling carnivals and sideshows. Her body was bought, sold, and traded like any other piece of entertainment equipment. Each new owner added their own embellishments to her story, creating increasingly elaborate tales about her life and origins. By the early 20th century, Julia's remains had found their way into more permanent institutional settings. Anatomical museums and medical schools acquired her body as a teaching specimen, though the educational value was questionable given the sensational context of her preservation. The transition from carnival attraction to scientific specimen represented a shift in how unusual bodies were exploited, but not an end to the exploitation itself. The remains eventually ended up in Norway, becoming part of the anatomical collection at Oslo University. During World War II, the Nazi regime took particular interest in Julia's case, using her as an example in their propaganda about racial hierarchies and human evolution. The Nazi exhibition of Julia's remains represented perhaps the darkest chapter in her posthumous exploitation, as her body was used to support ideologies that would have targeted her for elimination if she had been alive. After the war, Julia's remains were stored away from public view, but they weren't forgotten. Occasionally, they would be brought out for special exhibitions or scientific conferences. Each appearance generated controversy, as changing attitudes toward human dignity and scientific ethics made the continued display of her body increasingly problematic. The turning point came in the early 2000s when Mexican artist Laura Anderson Barbata learned about Julia's story and began advocating for the repatriation of her remains. Barbata spent years researching Julia's life, documenting the conditions of her exhibition and building support for bringing her home to Mexico. The campaign highlighted the ethical problems with displaying human remains without consent, and the particular injustices faced by people from marginalized communities. Barbata's advocacy efforts revealed disturbing details about how Julia's body had been treated over the decades. The remains had been stolen multiple times, vandalized by visitors, and stored in conditions that showed little respect for human dignity. The documentation of these abuses strengthened the case for repatriation and helped change attitudes about the ethics of displaying human remains. The repatriation process took nearly a decade, involving negotiations between Mexican authorities, Norwegian institutions, and various advocacy groups. Legal questions arose about who had the right to claim Julia's remains and where she should be buried. The complexity of these issues reflected the fact that Julia had been treated as property for so long that basic questions about her humanity had to be rediscovered. Norwegian authorities initially resisted the repatriation efforts, arguing that Julia's remains had scientific and historical value that justified their continued preservation. This position revealed how deeply embedded the attitudes that had led to her exploitation remained in institutional thinking. The idea that scientific interest could override human dignity died hard, even in the 21st century. The breakthrough came when Mexico formally requested Julia's repatriation through diplomatic channels, making it an official government-to-government negotiation rather than just an advocacy campaign. The Norwegian government eventually agreed to return the remains, acknowledging that continued possession could not be justified regardless of any scientific value they might have. On February 7, 2013, Oslo University formally transferred Julia Pastrana's remains to Mexican authorities. The ceremony was small and dignified, a stark contrast to the sensational exhibitions that had defined her posthumous existence. Mexican officials received the remains with the respect due to any citizen returning home after a long absence. Julia was finally buried on February 12, 2013, in a small cemetery in Sinaloa, near where she had been born 179 years earlier. The burial ceremony was attended by local officials, advocacy groups, and members of the indigenous community. For the first time since 1860, Julia Pastrana was treated as a human being deserving of dignity and respect, rather than as a curiosity to be examined. The story of Julia's repatriation inspired broader discussions about the ethics of displaying human remains and the legacy of scientific racism. Museums around the world began reviewing their collections, questioning whether they had the right to display bodies that had been acquired without proper consent. The case established important precedents for how institutions should handle similar situations. The long campaign to bring Julia home also highlighted the persistence of attitudes that had made her exploitation possible in the first place. Even in the 21st century, some argued that scientific and educational value should take precedence over human dignity. The fact that such arguments could still be made seriously demonstrated how far society still had to go in addressing the legacy of scientific racism. Julia Pastrana's grave in Sinaloa is marked by a simple headstone that identifies her only by name and dates. There's no mention of her unusual conditions, her career as a performer, or the 153 years she spent on display after death. The simplicity is intentional, treating her as what she always was, a human being who deserved better than what the world gave her. But Julia's story raises uncomfortable questions that remain unanswered. How many others like her are still on display in museums and private collections around the world? And what does it say about our society that it took until 2013 for us to recognize that some exhibitions should never have existed in the first place?